I want to thank each and one of you for sharing this opportunity with us on this day as we celebrate the achievements and the accolades of African Americans during Black History Month. In the early 19th century, in the state of Florida, there were only 3 high schools available for African Americans. One happened to be in Jacksonville, Florida, and the other one was in South Florida. And many of the smaller schools only went to the 8th grade, but those 3 were available in Florida. There was a young man who was bright, he was articulate, smart, and he had to wrangle his way to get admitted to the high school in Jacksonville. Finally, during the summer, this young man would pick fruit, run errands, clean houses to earn money to go to high school. And on that fateful day, the young man went upstairs, put his meager belongings in a suitcase, and wrapped it with a rope. When he got to the railway station, the agent informed the young man, and he said, because your suitcase is wrapped with a rope, it has to go as freight, and therefore it is additional cost. The young man didn't have any more money. He had spent all of his money for the fare to Jacksonville. And he went outside and he sat down on the steps of the railway station and he began to cry. Tears flowed. And finally, an old black man dressed in muddy overalls went over to the young man and said, boy, what you crying about? And the young man began to tell and explain to him how desperate he wanted to go to Jacksonville, 142 miles away, to finish high school. The old man in the overalls bent down and told him, said, boy, if education means that much to you, I'll pay your freight. He walked over to the agent, paid the additional freight cost, walked out of the door, and the young man didn't see him anymore, never met him, and didn't know who he was. The young man went on to finish high school in Jacksonville, finished Morehouse College, studied at Oberlin School of Religion, PhD from Crozier Theological Seminary. Name was Dr. Howard Thurman, an ordained Baptist minister who lectured at Oxford and Cambridge and recently retired before his death as the chaplain at Boston University. But the first book that he wrote, he dedicated it to the man in the overalls. So my pertinent question to you this morning is, when you do an unsolicited act of kindness, you can change the life of the individuals that you touch. And more than that, you can change your life. If you don't believe me, all of your work, even here at Cleveland International Airport, is not in vain. Whatever you do, it spreads goodwill.
Or black. No way to read.
There was a young man in 1899 who was born in Villa Roca, Georgia. At age 8 years of age, he began to show his musical talent. His mom was an organist and his dad was a music teacher, and they began to teach him music. And as he grew, he began to write music, but he began to write boogie woogie. You don't know what that is, but that's a form of secular music, blues. And his mom and dad tried to influence him, said, son, you need to write gospel music. He said, there is no money in gospel music. So why should I waste my talent? And he began to write many songs of jazz and blues. Moved to Chicago. There he married. One night, he got a call from Indianapolis Blues Festival. And they said, we need you to come over. And he told his wife, said, I don't think I should go since you're pregnant. She said, go, I'll be all right. Sure enough, he got in his old A-Mark Ford. He and a buddy drove to Indianapolis. And during his presentation, he got word that his wife had given birth, but the baby died. And he began to drive back to Chicago. An additional word came to him that his wife had passed too. When he got there, he was devastated with depression. He felt guilty for having to leave her. And over the next 2 or 3 weeks, he began to a melancholy of thoughts. And one day he and a friend were walking past the cemetery where his wife and his son was buried. And there, Thomas Dorsey began to think about words that would fit his life. And he wrote, precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on, let me stand. I'm tired and I'm weak and I'm worn. Through the storm and through the night, lead me on through the night. Take my hand, precious Lord, and lead me home. Those words became the emblem and the anthem of the civil rights movement, and that became Dr. Martin Luther King's Jr. only favorite gospel song.
You pay DJs and the fun for it units.
So one day, when I got back to my dormitory, there was a note on the door, and it said, Mr. Bozeman, you need to see the dean. I went to the dean's office, and there he told me that he had received a letter from the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, where Dr. King is pastor. And they need a driver for the church to pick up the students at Alabama State, and they need a driver to pick up the senior citizen. And then I was to come back and pick up Mrs. King and her 2 children, Yolanda and Dexter. When I took the letter, rang the doorbell, and Dr. King came to the door, and I explained my presence there, and he invited me in, set me down on a small settee adjacent to Mrs. King's piano, and he began to interview me. What are your aspirations? What do you want to do when you finish Alabama State? What's your major? What's your minor? And at one time I thought I was going to be pastor, but he kept asking me a lot of questions. And finally he said, okay, the job is yours. There are only 2 criteria that you be courteous, and that you be on time. So I began to drive Dr. King and Mrs. King around the state of Alabama. And when I would pick up my passengers at Alabama State, I would drop them off at Dexter. I would go in the community and pick up my senior citizen. And then I would go back and pick up Mrs. King and Martin and Yolanda. However, the situation would reverse itself after 11 o'clock services, where she would drive the family car home and take her children. And I was to go back to the church and pick up Dr. King if he had a speaking engagement, or if he didn't, he would drop me off at my dormitory, and that would be it for the day. Over the next 3 or 4 months, as I drove Mrs. King to Mobile, her brother was in the hospital there, and she and I were riding along, and I said, it was a dizzy day like it is outside now, drizzling. I said, Miss King, tell me about the first time that your house was bombed. She looked at me, and I thought I had said something wrong. She said, you know, Mr. Bozeman said, I was sitting in the sunroom where you and Martin were talking when he interviewed you, and I heard a thud on the front porch. She said it was an unfamiliar sound. So she and a friend of hers moved to the back of the house. Immediately after she closed the door, the bomb went off. As she was telling me this story, tears were running down her cheek. And you know, this was 3 years after the incident. So she said to me, it must have been God's radar that directed me to safety. On several occasions, when Dr. King and he would have special speaking engagements, we would leave directly after church services and go to rural areas in Alabama. Greensboro, Tuskegee, Talladega, Sylacauga. And during the trip, he and I would chat, we would talk. But I remember specifically one night, we were coming back from a speaking engagement, and he had spoken made 2 sermons, and he was dead tired. And he began to nod. Now, do you hunch Dr. King and tell him he's nodding and talking in his sleep, or you let him sleep? I chose to hunch him. Sure enough, I said, Doc, do you know you were talking in your sleep? He said, what did I say? I said, that's between me and the Lord. But you know, I think that he was tired and weary because of all the threats on his life, all of the demands of his life. He talks about that sometimes he was only getting 2 to 3 hours sleep per night, trying to organize and carry out demands on his time to improve man's life with social justice. But he talks about a specific incident that happened in August. He talks about this in August 1967 at the Mount Pisgah Baptist Church in Chicago. He talks about having come in from a long day of meeting at the Montgomery Improvement Association. And as it was midnight, he says, and he opened the door, and the moment that he opened the door, the telephone rang. He picked it up. He was thinking that it was part of the continuous discussion from the meeting of the Montgomery Improvement Association. But he said, on the other end was a nasty voice. And he said, boy, use the N-word though. If you're not out of town in 3 days, we're gonna bomb your house and kill your family. And he said that disturbed him. So he got up and went and looked in the bedroom, and he saw his committed wife, and he had one child, Yolanda at the time, and he closed the door. He got a cup of coffee, thinking that the coffee would relieve his anxiety. Then he said, he bowed his head and began to pray. He said, Lord, I'm weak now, and I need your help. Come by here. I don't want my constituents to see me in this weakened condition. Come by here. Still looking down at that cup of coffee, Dr. King said that he heard a voice from the Holy Spirit. Martin Luther King Jr., stand up for truth. Stand up for righteousness. Stand up for justice. And lo, I'll be with you even until the end of the time. And he said that was a psychological blow. That was a psychological positive impact on Dr. King, because he had begun to suffer from depression. And he said that he had to move. And then he talks about the time that he was in Memphis. He said he got on the plane early that morning in Atlanta. He said that the pilot said on the PA system, we're sorry for the delay, but we have Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. on the plane. And it's been protected and guarded all night. And he said that when he got into Memphis, he had heard about all of the threats on his life. And he said that didn't bother him. He said that as he stood before the trash collectors that night, April the 3rd, 1968, trying to bring an awareness to the conditions of the workers of the city of Memphis. But he said that when he started talking about and he learned of their plight, that he said, I just want to help them along the way. Finally, he stood before the group and he said, still talking at the Mason Temple Church of God in Christ. And he said that he told the group, he was talking to the group, and he said, I'm happy tonight. Wait, go back. He said, sometime I don't know what will happen to me now. We have got some difficult days that are here. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind like anybody. I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And he's allowed me to go up to the mountain. I may not get there with you. But I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And so I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. That is his prophecy for death. The next day, the very next day, April the 4th, 1968, at approximately 6:15 p.m., Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was preparing to go to dinner with his two good friends, the Reverend Ralph David Abernathy and Reverend Billy Samuel Cowles. As they scurried around room 306 in the Lorraine Motel, Dr. King asked the philosophical question of the day: where's my necktie? Where's my little pretty necktie I like to wear? And his friend of 14 years, Reverend Ralph Abernathy, said, Martin, it's on the chair where I pressed it for you. And as soon as Dr. King had knotted his tie, there was a voice outside of room 306 on the lower parking level. It was the voice of the Reverend Jesse Jackson, who yelled up to 306, Doc, hey Doc, Ben Branch is here. Ben came to serenade you with his new horn. He came to play Precious Lord for you.
Wow.
Dr. King looked to his right. He told Ralph Abernathy, I just want Ben to play real pretty tonight. Then he looked to his left. Told the Reverend Billy Cowles, I just want to hear him play Precious Lord for me. Stepped out on the balcony, and Dr. King never heard one musical note that Ben Branch had prepared for him. He was shot with a 30.06 Game Master rifle. And the force of the bullet was so powerful, ladies and gentlemen, that it untied the knot that he had just tied in his tie. And he was laying on the balcony there for 11 minutes before help could arrive, because the lady at the switchboard at the Lorraine Hotel had a heart attack. Finally, he was transported to St. Joseph's Hospital, rushed to the ER room on a rickety old gurney. And there he was met by a medical team, hematologists, thoracic surgeons, registered nurses. But the first words out of Dr. Rufus Brown's mouth was tracheotomy. For 32 minutes, that medical team worked to try to save the life of Dr. King. And finally, about 6:52 on that fateful day, Dr. Ted Gioia, a tall Sicilian American, walked over to Reverend Ralph Abernathy and said, he's gone. And that's good. And Reverend Abernathy said, Doctor, why do you say that's good? He said, because had Dr. King lived, there is a possibility and a probability that he would have been paralyzed from the neck down and in a comatose state. And that's not Dr. King. You know Cleveland? He died a painful death. But it was not the bullet that killed Dr. King. It was the atmosphere of hatred, racism, man's inhumanity to man that created the atmosphere for his death. But you know, 2 months before he died, to the exact date he predicted his funeral, he preached his own funeral at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. I'm coming to a close now. And Dr. King said on February the 4th, now he was shot on April the 4th, but on February the 4th at the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, he stood before that congregation and he said this. So every now and then, I guess we all think realistically about that day when we will be victimized by what is life's most common denominator, and that's death. And historians and sociologists tell me that for some reason he was emotional and perspiring. He said, I think about my own death and I think about my own funeral. I don't think about it in a morbid sense, but every now and then I ask myself what I want them to be saying at my funeral. He said, I come before you this morning and I'll let you know. I don't want a long funeral. And if you get somebody to deliver the eulogy, tell him not to talk too long. And every now and then I wonder what I want him to say. Tell him not to mention that I have a Nobel Peace Prize. That's not important. Tell him not to mention that I have 300 or 400 other awards. That's not important. But I'd like somebody to say on that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to love somebody. And I want you to say on that day he tried to be right and walk with them. And I want you to say on that day that I tried to feed the hungry and visit those in prison. Tried to clothe the naked. And I want you to say on that day that I visit those in jail. Yes, if you want to say that I was a drum major, say I was a drum major for justice. That's all I want to say. I don't have many things to leave with you. I don't have any more luxurious items. But this, if I can help somebody along the way, then my living will not be in vain. Cleveland, tomorrow morning when you have your first cup of Starbucks and you open your morning newspaper, be it the Cleveland Plain Dealer or the Akron Beacon Journal, could be the New York Times, it could be the Atlanta Constitution, could be the Memphis Commercial Appeal or the Boston Globe. But whatever newspaper you open, ask yourself, tell yourself that if I can help somebody along the way, then my living shall not be in vain. God bless you and thank you.